Michael Rice. I'm the state superintendent. I want to welcome you to the Michigan Department of Education's Comprehensive History Instruction webinar series. Today, we're fortunate to have an exceptional presenter to discuss the Equal Rights Movement. This session offers educators greater depth of knowledge about this diverse social movement that has sought equal rights and opportunities and greater personal freedom for women, and the impact the movement has had on Michigan and our country. This is the sixth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with a comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history, including about difficult and searing subjects such as race, racism, sexism, colonialism, and xenophobia. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all to our children. This broad effort will help you as educators learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We are grateful for our presenter today, Dr. LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University and Assistant Editor for the Journal of African American History. Dr. Harris's research engages with women, gender and sexuality, labor and the working class, urban history, and social and cultural change. Dr. Harris received a Ph.D. in history from Howard University in 2007. In this webinar series, she will discuss the Equal Rights Movement and its complexity. Thanks to Dr. Harris for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding among our educators. Thanks to the education organizations whose partnership in an era of attempts to narrow curriculum and encourage subject and book banning is inspiring in and of itself. Thanks to the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team for its continued efforts in organizing spaces for us to meet and learn. And finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for your courage, interest, and conviction. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Renee Garcia, the department's Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Renee, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenters may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of this event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide a link or links to resources using the chat feature throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website, and we will stick that link also in the chat. If you would like sketchies for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketchies link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the view button at the top right of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps to inform future webinars. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace Barrett. Thank you, Candace. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. LaShawn.
Thank you, Dr. Rice and Ms. Garcia, for that warm introduction. I am going to share my screen with the audience, so just give me a few minutes. Okay, the title of my presentation, I have two titles actually. The first title is Equal Rights Movement, a look into Black women, migration, and Jim Crow North. And the second title is Who Set You Floating? Southern Blacks and Urban Migration in the North in particular. And that particular title, Who Set You Floating, comes from this particular book. This is Farah Jasmine Griffin. She wrote a book called Who Set You Floating, the African-American Migration Narrative. I first want to start off with a story about this woman at the top. Her name is Eleanor Williams. In 1943, Eleanor Williams walked out of state prison in North Carolina, where she spent 8 months for assault. Upon leaving the prison, Eleanor was elated. She must have thought, quote unquote, freedom, freedom at last, no more guards, no more uncomfortable beds or bland tasting food, no more bodily restrictions. Her time and her body were hers again. Breathing and smelling fresh air, seeing endless stretches of dirt roads and green meadows, and thoughts of preparing home-cooked meals and embracing her daughter and other loved ones warmed Eleanor's heart. She felt a sense of relief walking out of prison, as well as a profound sense or feeling of purpose. Prison release ushered new possibilities and dreams for Eleanor. One of those dreams was leaving North Carolina. Eleanor imagined freedom in a new city, a place, to borrow from Richard Wright's classic 1945 memoir, Black Boy, quote unquote, where everything was possible. A place where she could start anew, secure decent housing and employment, and earn enough money to secure herself and her daughter. The formerly incarcerated mother visualized existing in a geographical setting that was radically different from the one she was born in and raised in, and one that was beyond the prison walls that she had just been released from. The North Carolina native yearned to leave her hometown, a complicated space symbolic of racial exclusion, family happiness and death, penal confinement, and fractured domestic relationships. Embodying blues singer Bessie Smith's 1924 Woman's Trouble Blues, a song about migration, isolation, and imprisonment, Eleanor visualized while in captivity, quote unquote, when I get out of jail, I'm gonna leave this town, end quote. And Eleanor made plans to leave North Carolina, heading straight for the northern big city. But migration would be bittersweet. Departure would be painful. Exodus entailed leaving behind all that she knew and those that she had loved. It meant saying goodbye to surrogate mother figures, her friends, and other relatives, all who embraced her imperfections and served as sources of unconditional love. The journey away from her birthplace meant taking a chance on a radical experiment in a new place. Aspirations for better living conditions and happiness in a new city were not always guaranteed. Nothing was promised, not even survival. Locating a job and affordable housing, finding trustworthy people, and navigating a fast-paced metropolis would not be easy. But it was a risk Eleanor had to take. She was willing to leave the only place she had ever knew to go to a place she had only fantasized about. Like other Black Southerners making the decision to leave the South for the Northern Promised Land, Eleanor was a visionary, a dream chaser. The Southern young woman was courageously ready to fling herself into the unknown, taking a huge leap of faith. She stood at the forefront of a personal transformation that would alter her life and the urban American landscape. Sometime between 1943 and 1945, Eleanor migrated either by train, bus, or car to what Harlem Renaissance writer Wallace Sturman referred to as, quote unquote, the Great Black City, New York. She joined the nearly 5 million Black Southerners who trekked to Northern, Southern, and Midwestern and Western urban spaces during the Second Great Migration. And I think it's important to note that when we think about the Great Migration, while we know that this is a mass movement of Blacks from the American South to urban spaces in the North, the Midwest, the West, and even to the urban South, this is also not just a mass migration of people, but also a mass migration of ideas and customs, rituals, memories, and hauntings of life and everyday practices of life. So for the rest of my time, or part of the rest of my time, I'm going to talk about a few of these things: the Great Migration, the visual art behind it a little bit, reasons for migration, the lure to the cities, perceptions of the city, consequences of leaving, obstacles in the city, and if we have time, documenting migration, particularly through blues music. When we think about migration, migration is really part of Blacks or African Americans' broader ideas about like what freedom is. And for many, freedom is about movement, right? The freedom to move, the freedom to have bodily autonomy, and the freedom to exist in a geographical space that one can reside in, work in, socialize in, and just be in. So when we think about migration, who are we exactly talking about? Migrants came from various socioeconomic backgrounds and were of various ages. So the people who are leaving, making that decision to leave their hometowns, are entire families. Some are single men, single women, some are teenagers, high school graduates and high school students, college students and college graduates, and formerly incarcerated people like Eleanor Williams. But all of them were risk takers and dreamers, all wanting a better life for themselves and their families. So let's just talk a little bit about the numbers. The first Great Migration, roughly between 1915 and 1930, an estimated 1.25 million Southerners relocated to urban or industrial cities, including Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. I forgot to mention, I think this is on the slide already, but the time period I'm mostly talking about is the first Great Migration. I know the Eleanor Williams story is during the 40s, but much of what I'll be saying is from the early 20th century. The second Great Migration is roughly between the 1940s and the 1970s. And between that time, an estimated 4.5 million Blacks migrated to northern and Midwestern cities and also to the far West. Between 1915 and 1970s, over 6 million Blacks left their homes in the South and moved to states in the North, the West. But it's also important to keep in mind that the vast majority of African Americans resided in the American South. So just for a second, I'm going to show you a couple of numbers and maps that I think are helpful. They're usually helpful for myself and my students when we're talking about migration. So this right here, this gives you the increase in the Black population of northern cities between 1910 and 1930. So if you look at a place like New York, for example, in 1910, that population was roughly a little over 91,000 folk. By the 1930s, we have over 300,000 African Americans residing in New York City. That also includes the Caribbean population. It's also important to keep in mind that the Caribbean population was the largest in New York City during the 1920s and 1930s. Other cities that are interesting to point out in terms of the influx of people coming into those spaces is Detroit. And Detroit is the fourth city. In 1910, but 5,700 African Americans resided in the city. By the 1920s, we have over 120,000 African Americans in that particular city. Another useful map to talk about migration is the inward migration, the southern rural to urban migration, what scholars call an inward migration. So there may not be people who are leaving South Carolina or North Carolina and heading to New York or New Jersey or Philadelphia, but there may be people from like Virginia who live in the country, for example, like Goochland County, which is about maybe about an hour out, maybe 45 minutes to an hour out of Richmond, who may move to urban cities in southern places. So for example, if we think about Richmond, in the 1910s, the population was a little bit over 46,000 people. But in 1930, that population rises to over 5,700. So it's important to talk about this kind of inward migration that we see happening. And people who are deciding to go from the rural spaces to the urban spaces in the South are doing that for a whole bunch of reasons. One is for better economic opportunities, the prospect of industrial jobs. A second reason is a change from rural life, people just wanting to live in a more metropolitan city. And also the third reason, or another reason, is the desire to stay close to family. And I think the last map that I'm going to show you is one of my favorites that I like to show students, is the migratory patterns. So here we have folks, if you look at the yellow line, people who reside in the Southeast, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, those migrants tend to migrate to the Northeast. So they're migrating to Richmond, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia. Folks who live in South Central, which would be like Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, those folks in terms of migratory patterns are going to places like Cincinnati, Daytona, Chicago, Toledo, Detroit. And folks who reside in the southwest part of the country, those folks are going to the Midwest as well as to the far west. So the numbers become, I think, important to show students, as well as the map is a great tool. Another way to show migration, which I like because I'm a visual learner, is art, the visual. And I love showing the Jacob Lawrence migration series. And right here is Jacob Lawrence. This particular series was published between 1940 and 1941. There are about 60 different paintings. And this project was funded by FDR's New Deal, particularly the WPA, which stands for the Works Project Administration. So I just want to show you a couple of pictures, which I think are really fascinating, pictures that I actually love. This first picture is great. So here we have African Americans, very much like the birds at the top, taking flight. And here you have entire families, men, women, little children, carrying bags, sometimes carrying all that they had, their precious goods. I think Lawrence does an excellent job at catching the beauty of migration for some migrants. Another really interesting photo are these two. Here we have African Americans, migrants waiting for a train. And again, entire families, single folk, sometimes college students, high school students, all waiting together. Another image of African Americans either waiting for a bus or a train to a northern city. And this is one of my favorites. Here you have African Americans aborting a train, perhaps most likely a Jim Crow cart. And here's another image. And I like to point out to students, particularly with this image, here you have, again, entire families. You have, adults, you have little children, perhaps teenagers. You have this little baby right here. There's a bottle. That's how we know it's a baby. And then you have this basket right here of food. And oftentimes, and I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I do have some scholarship I would like to point out that gives you the details about this. But oftentimes when African Americans are riding in Jim Crow carts, the dining carts are often for whites, and many migrants are packing what we call these kind of like shoebox lunches, right? So this is what this is right here. Family and relatives who don't want to see their loved ones leave are preparing them for this long trip, wherever they may be going, but have prepared these kind of sort of box or shoebox lunches, which consist of a whole bunch of different items. I should save this slide for later, but this is a good slide, that a good picture in which Jacob Lawrence imagines what it's like in the North. African Americans some of them have a perception of what the North is like, that the North is not like the Jim Crow of the South, but there is a form of de facto segregation, racial exclusion, and this is what they contend with. And I think Jacob Lawrence does an excellent job at kind of capturing, racial exclusion and the separation of the race in urban spaces. So I want to turn your attention to the reasons for migration. Why do people leave? So I'm going to be a little bit long-winded on this, so just bear with me. So why are people leaving? Number one, wartime opportunities furnished by World War I, which is between 1914 and 1918. And African Americans, particularly men, hope to gain a foothold in the industrial field. That oftentimes does not happen. If African American men and women are afforded industrial jobs, if they secure industrial jobs, they are often given the dirtiest and most unskilled industrial labor. African Americans are leaving for better labor opportunities, better wages, perhaps better housing facilities. African Americans are leaving because of the perception of the North. There's all of these different stories of how Black migrants are treated. There's stories about the North as an opportunity, of a site of opportunity for freedom and opportunities for different economic and social mobility. But we know that this is not what many people have to contend with. And we notice, if we think about someone like a Rosa Parks, for example, when Rosa Parks migrates to Detroit in 1950, right after the boycott in 1955, she comes to Detroit. She travels around first, but then she comes to Detroit, and she calls Detroit the promised land that wasn't. She actually compared Detroit to Alabama. So there's all of these kind of stories about urban spaces as sites of opportunity and freedom. And for many people, they see the North as a land that is free of lynching, free of racial exclusion, free of discrimination, as well as free of white supremacy. But we know that not to be the case. Jim Crow segregation is not a Southern problem, it is a national problem. We also know that the North is very distinct in how Jim Crow plays out, or how racial exclusion plays out. Other reasons for leaving the South. urban amusements, a chance and the opportunity to take part in urban leisure, right? Pleasure politics, if you will. Attending nightclubs or going to nightclubs, going to cabarets, going to taverns, going to rent parties and house parties, things that migrants may not be able to do in their southern communities. Other reasons for migration: a chance to remake one's self, right? To craft, to reinvent oneself with a new identity. This becomes really attractive for many African Americans. I always say to my students, when they think about migrating, why would you want to leave and go to another place aside from the economic opportunity? What does leaving give you the opportunity to do? And it gives you the opportunity to remake oneself. Chain migration, movement in which prospective migrants learn of opportunities and have initial accommodations and employment arrangements by means of social relations with previous migrants. Migrants are hearing great stories about the North from labor agents, from relatives who have already migrated to a different city, and from various Black newspapers, for example, the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender is a Black newspaper in Chicago. And I just want to read a direct quote that was in a 1970 paper. So the Chicago Defender sent out and calls to Blacks in the South, telling them to come to the North. In one editorial, the paper said, quote unquote, "To die from the bite of frost is far more glorious than to die from the bite of the mob," meaning the lynch mob. "I beg you, my brothers, to leave that benighted land. You are free men." Other stories about the North we can see in letters, which are an excellent primary source for students. And I believe that you can download some of these migration letters from the Library of Congress. I think some of this stuff is actually digitized. So one scholar has argued that the single most important factor in helping folk to migrate north was letters from relatives, but also when migrants are coming home to visit. And when they come back to visit, and in these letters, as they're writing home, they're talking about and they're showing, people money. They're coming back and visiting in nice clothes. There's stories about urban life, about culture and amusement. And again, these are factors that kind of lure people to the South. To the North. Other factors entail Southern race hierarchy, why folks are leaving. Many are leaving because of this intense threat of Jim Crow segregation and de facto laws. So more than 400 state laws, constitutional amendments, and city ordinances legalizing segregation and discrimination were passed in the United States between 1865 and 1967. These laws govern nearly every aspect of daily life, from education to public transportation, from healthcare and housing to the use of public facilities. So African Americans in general, the society was segregated. We're talking about orphanages, mental institutions, buses, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So what is segregation, right? So segregation is essentially white domination and Black subordination. Segregation is an elaborate process designed by whites to physically separate Blacks and whites using social customs as well as legal means. And I'll talk about social customs in a minute. Segregation is a way to control African Americans. Segregation is a way to exclude African Americans from public life. Segregation defines whiteness and Blackness, unites whites across class lines. Segregation is a way to publicly humiliate African Americans. Segregation is a way to make African Americans feel like they don't belong. And segregation is a way to make African Americans feel like they are un-American. Other factors driving African Americans from the South is domestic terrorism and lynching. So lynching in the American South. Roughly between the 1880s and the 1960s, reported cases of lynching included over 3,500 reported cases. And we know this because of several different texts. The first text is a red record, and a red record was published by Ida B. Wells, and this is in the 1890s, and this is one of her books. She wrote 2 books on lynching. Another text about the lynching numbers is 30 years of lynching in the United States between 1889 and 1918, which was produced by the NAACP, which was an organization that was formed in about 1909. Another source in terms of lynching numbers we know from Bryan Stevenson. And you may know Bryan Stevenson if you've read his book, Just Mercy, or if you've seen the film Just Mercy starring Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx, or if you've been to the Legacy Museum, also known as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It is these lynching numbers, right? The lynching numbers, the witnessing of lynchings that will drive African Americans out of the South. It's also important to note that the lynching numbers by the NAACP and other organizations, even educational organizations, such as the Tuskegee Institute, they also produce lynching numbers during the early 20th century, that it's these particular numbers that will be used to lobby Congress to support an anti-lynching bill, which is also known as the Dyer Act, during the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s, right? So it's this experience of white violence, domestic terrorism, that fuels that upward migration. So before I go on, I want to just give you a small clip of lynching in America, the Great Migration. This is from Bryan Stevenson's organization, the Equal Justice Initiative. So I'll just play a little bit of this.
Put yourself in a situation where you're 7, you pack up everything you can fit and you leave right away, because if he did not, he was going to be hanging from a tree.
He was old enough and aware enough to realize that they murdered his dad and that they had to then run.
That's why you have 7 uncles who leave and never come back to Alabama. The racial terror has been embedded into you generation after generation.
My family didn't leave the South. They were chased away from the South. Half of the Black population of Abbeville was gone within the next 10 years.
It's one of the largest migrations of people in the world from the South to the North. They were fleeing, basically as refugees. Put your
If we think about gendering migration, and we talk about like the nuances of migration, it may be a good point of reference to think about the different ways in which Black women thought about migration and why Black women might migrate, if we're gendering migration. And if we're thinking about primary sources, I would recommend this book by Darlene Clark Hine. And Darlene Clark Hine is is one of the most prolific pioneers in the study of Black women's history. She was also she's professor emeritus at Michigan State University. She just retired a couple of years ago. And I would recommend this book, Hindsight, Black Women and the Reconstruction of American History. So if we think about gendering migration and thinking about the different ways in which Black women are thinking about leaving, I think it's important to kind of to elevate some of those reasons. So Black women are leaving the South for a whole bunch of reasons. Very much for, just like Black men, educational opportunities, economic opportunities, but they're also leaving for other reasons. Some of those reasons include sexual violence at the hands of both white and Black men. Some women are leaving the South to start entertainment careers as blues singers. Some women are leaving the South because of bad relationships, and some women are leaving the South to start over. So I also want to play for you a song which I think is important if we're thinking about gendering migration, and it's a blues song. And the blues music becomes a good way to document migration, whether it's Black women or Black men. And I say that because some of the things that we can't find in the archive, meaning the emotionalism of people, meaning the interior motivation and the interior lives, we can find in blues music. So some singers I think are worth noting when it comes to music and migration. I would highlight this man. This is Muddy Waters. I would highlight Billie Holiday, which I think most people know. I would highlight this woman in the center. This is Ma Rainey. If you've seen August Wilson's Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, starring Viola Davis, then you know a little bit about Ma Rainey. And I would highlight Bessie Smith. So I'm going to play for you Ma Rainey's 1924 song, Farewell Daddy Blues. And if you're interested in, Black women and the blues, I would recommend this book. This is entitled Blues Legacy and Black Women and Feminism, and this is by Angela Davis. Okay, so before I play this song, I'm just going to read to you the lyrics, and then I'll. So this is Farewell Daddy Blues, was produced in 1924. The song is about heartbreak and heartache and love loss and partner mistreatment. I'll just read a little bit. I'm wild about my daddy. I want him all the time. Wild about my daddy. I want him all the time. But I don't want you daddy if I can't call you mine. Got the farewell bluesies and my trunk is packed. Got the farewell bluesies and my trunk is packed, but I don't want no daddy because I ain't coming back. So I'll just play a little bit.
I'm wild about my daddy. I want him all the time. Wild about my daddy. I want him all the time. But I don't want your daddy if I can't call you mine. Got the farewell bluesies and my trunk is packed. Got the farewell bluesies and my trunk is packed. But I don't want no daddy because I ain't coming back. Oh, farewell daddy, oh, honey,
So the other factor I want to turn our attention to is the consequences of leaving, as well as obstacles in the city. So the consequences of leaving or even being left includes leaving families behind, sometimes leaving children behind. Some Black women will leave their little ones behind because they want to go to the city and get settled, and later within, maybe a matter of maybe days, months, or even years, or even decades, then bring those children with them. Another consequence of leaving is the temporary cutting of community ties and networks and friendships and support systems. These are all systems that will have to be forged when they get to a new place. And these are all systems that have to be maintained, especially as they've left the South. And this is why it's important for people to write letters, to call home when they can, or even to visit. Then you have the emotionalism of leaving or being left, the sadness. Clara Smith in her song Freight Train Blues captures this beautifully. In this particular song, she laments over her lover's departure to the North. She says, quote unquote, or she sings, quote unquote, "I have to hear that engine blow. Every time I hear it, it blows. I feel like riding too," right? So while people are going away, leaving for better opportunities, better economic opportunities, better housing facilities, et cetera, there's this consequence of leaving folks who are, their sources of support. The last piece for this part of the presentation focuses on the obstacles in the city. The obstacles in the city that people have to contend with include poor housing and high rent. Northern style prejudice relegated Black families to some of the most crime-ridden sections of various parts of the cities and to inadequate and expensive housing structures. Residing in the same communities and rental apartments as their white counterparts, Black New Yorkers in other spaces typically paid more money per month for their rental properties. For instance, the New York Age, which was an African-American newspaper, reported that during the 1920s, African-American families living on 125th Street moved into a 5-room apartment paying $80 per month, while their former white tenant paid $40 per month. Colored tenants, as the newspaper went on, paid twice as much as white tenants for apartments with leaky ceilings, rats, smashed windows, and the daily stench of garbage. But Black New Yorkers were not alone in facing housing discrimination and paying high-price rental prices. Overpriced housing dwellings were commonplace for African Americans residing in urban, northern, and Midwestern communities. Blacks residing in Indianapolis, the Black side, known as Bucktown, quote unquote, paid $25 a month for quote unquote filthy 1-bedroom frame houses that rented to whites for $18. And in Chicago, African Americans on average paid at least hundreds of dollars more for rent than whites between about 1909 and the 1920s. So poor housing, high rents is something that they have to contend with. They also have to contend with labor exclusion or labor discrimination. Menial employment wages stood in the way of African Americans' ability to afford high rental spaces, household necessities, transportation costs, and other city expenses. According to one Detroiter, quote unquote, living is so high that you just got to scrub and scrub for the pennies to pay for the bills, end quote. Racial exclusion in the urban labor markets effectively barred Black men and women from skilled, high-paying positions, including industrial labor. In the 1910s, about 12% of Black men worked in mechanical and manufacturing jobs. And by the 1920s, that proportion increased to about 21%. At least 2/3 of all gainfully employed Black men occupy positions as janitors, elevator operators, waiters, and personal servants. Black women fare no better. The vast majority of working class and working poor Black women are engaging in domestic work. So what do I mean by domestic work? I'm talking about as maids, as laundress, as cooks, as quote unquote nannies. And this can also be said about women who have high school diplomas and who also have college degrees, people who we would normally consider to be middle class by virtue that they have these higher educations. Other obstacles that people face in the North, or that they have to at least confront or contend with, is the criminalization of daily behavior, right? So essentially racial profiling. So who's doing this racial profiling? I'm talking about police, vice agents. These vice agents are men and women, usually white men and women of the city, who are concerned about the influx of immigrants as well as the influx of Southern Blacks. These are people who are concerned with vice in the city, crime in the city. They are concerned with prostitution. They are concerned with sex syndicates. They are concerned with gambling, any type of illicit or informal economy. These are also people who have a particular perception about African Americans. Many of them, not all, but many of them see them as criminals. They see them as people who refuse to work idle, and they also see them as hypersexual. And all of these things, the criminalization, seen as idle or hypersexual, these are our vestiges from slavery, if you will. So perceptions of Southern Blacks. And also, if we think about African Americans themselves, Southern migrants also have to contend with urban Black perceptions of Southern Blacks. So Northern-born Blacks' perceptions of Southerners, as well as Southern Blacks who have settled in the city, have lived in the city for some years or maybe even decades, have a perception about their Black Southern brothers and sisters. And some of them may see them as, kind of being uncouth or, not ready for the metropolis, as, not as suave, kind of bringing up to the North these kind of country ways. So these are many things that they have to contend with. This is a great photo or great flyer. This flyer is from the Chicago Defender. From the Urban League, right? This is from the Urban League. So the National Urban League is formed in 1910. And the Urban League is an interracial organization composed of mostly of social workers, Black and white social workers who essentially study the city. They are concerned about employment, labor discrimination, housing inequities, and also policing. But they also are a race reform agency in the business of helping Southern migrants. So I found this in the Chicago Defender, actually, and this is from the Chicago League of Urban Conditions among Negroes. So it says, and you can read this, if you are in a city, if you're a stranger in the city, if you want a job, if you want a place to live, if you are having trouble with your employer, if you want information or advice of any kind, call the Urban League, right? And again, this is to really tell Southern Blacks that if they find themselves in trouble, if they need help, to call on respectable organizations, right? Many people, especially if they believe in the ideas about like racial uplift and respectability politics, they don't want these Southern migrants falling lure to deceptive labor agents, or they don't want Southern Black women falling lured to, brothels or kind of unrespectable type of labor. So these things become really important. These organizations become important for Southern Blacks. These are just a few more pictures. I don't think I have a lot of time left, but a few more pictures of Blacks who are migrating. Here we have children. And I don't think enough is done about children's experiences during the Great Migration. We know a lot, I think, about adults, men and women, but it would be interesting to have scholarship on children and some of their insights on leaving. Another image, I believe this is Chicago. This is Union Station, African Americans waiting for a train. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a great teaching tool. So here you have Black women and Black girls leaving to go somewhere. I don't have the context for this photo, but I always tell my class, look at how these women are dressed to leave, to go somewhere, to migrate, dressed in, almost in their Sunday best, the stockings, the shoes, the dresses, the hats. I think this is a really gorgeous picture. Other folks who migrate. So when we think about migration, it's not just about going from one place and settling in another place. Migration is also about traveling for labor purposes, for your job, or for leisure, right? I just want to highlight these two women. This woman right here, I think most people know, this is Zora Neale Hurston, Harlem Renaissance writer. And Hurston frequently traveled throughout the South during the 1930s. She worked under a New Deal program, was the Federal Writers Project. So she was constantly traveling alone at that in the South for work. Another person that traveled frequently throughout the South is Ella Baker, who is from North Carolina. And she migrates to New York City sometime in the 30s, 40s. And Ella Baker was a field secretary for the NAACP. And throughout the 1940s and 50s, Ella Baker is traveling throughout the South, setting up, and again, it's dangerous to be traveling in the South as a woman, but also as a Black woman, traveling throughout the South, setting up NAACP chapters. You may not know her as a NAACP worker, but you may know her during the Civil Rights Movement. So if Rosa Parks is the mother of the Civil Rights Movement, then Ella Baker is the grandmother of the Civil Rights Movement. She is influential in helping form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is known as SNCC, during the 1960s. And she worked very closely with Martin Luther King and the formation of the Southern SCLC, which stands for the Southern Leadership Christian Conference, which was formed in 1957. Okay. Just some secondary sources I think that might be useful for you. Driving Black, A Story of Race and Resistance by Mia Bay. Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights by Gretchen Soren. And Overground Railroad, the Green Book, which I don't think I have enough time to talk about, maybe later, maybe next time we meet. The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. This book is by Candice Taylor. These are all great books about not just the Great Migration, but Black travel in general. And if you're interested in talking to your students about the logistics, the planning that went into making that trek from the South to the North, I would highly suggest Driving While Black as well as Traveling Black. So it's a 4:55. I don't think I have time to talk about the Green Book, but I promise I will talk about the Green Book during the next lecture series, which is next week. I look forward to discussing more with you about migration and particularly about the Green Book, as well as Black women's political activism during the early 20th century. Thank you for joining me today, and I appreciate any feedback you may have. Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Harris. Thank you. Thank you for sharing yourself and all of your studies with the teachers of Michigan. We're excited to hear session 2 and session 3 over the next 2 weeks. So we will come back to that. But I also, before we go, want to thank Dr. Rice, our state superintendent, for his vision and leadership for the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar. We are very appreciative of that and getting us rolling here in this. 4 sessions on the Equal Rights Movement, March 22 and March 29. They will both be from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Comprehensive History website and register for each state to participate in future webinars as linked in the chat. We invite you to register for these events if you have not already. We appreciate you joining us today. Please make sure that you complete the survey for this event. It will be emailed to you after the session ends. All right, that takes us to the end of tonight. We thank you all. Have